Good afternoon. The lecture for this afternoon will concentrate upon the Civil War and the contributions of African Americans to this conflict. Uh, First thing I want to say about the Civil War is to understand that from the perspective of the Southerners, it was very obvious that the Civil War was fought over the issue of slavery. And anyone would have to do is um, to look at the speeches that were given by the Confederates, uh, who office holders such as Jefferson Davis, who was the president, and Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president. And the Southerners were definitely fighting over the issue of slavery, that they wanted to keep African Americans as slaves. Now, for the Northerners or the Union, it's going to be entirely different because as you look over the events before the 1860s, and in particular in 1860 when Lincoln was elected, in 1861 when uh, South Carolina attacked Fort Sumter, I don't think you could say that the northern states were fighting to stop slavery. They were fighting to stop the expansion of slavery. And that is that they believed that where slavery existed, it was okay. So it was okay in South Carolina and in Georgia and all of the other uh, southern states. And just remember also that not all slave states seceded from the Union. When we get to talking about that, remember Kentucky didn't secede, uh, Maryland didn't secede, uh, Missouri didn't secede, so not all slave states seceded. So that I think strengthens my point in terms of why did the Union go to war, and it was not over whether slavery was right or wrong. It might have been an issue of whether slavery should or should not expand. That is why the Republican Party came into existence. Now, when we talk about the Civil War, many people who do not know their history focus upon the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Emancipation Proclamation will go into effect on July the 1st, 1863. And this is where Lincoln will say, quote, all persons held as slaves with any state in rebellion against the United States shall be then this henceforth and forever free, unquote. But please notice the wording. He said all persons held in slaves with any states in rebellion. Thus, with the Emancipation Proclamation, remember what Abraham Lincoln will do. Abraham Lincoln will free the slaves that were in rebellion against the United States, but not free the slaves where they were not in rebellion. Thus, for example, in a slave state like Kentucky that did not secede from the Union, the slaves were not free in Kentucky. That will come later. So I always say to students, remember, Abraham Lincoln did not end slavery. The ending of slavery will come in the 13th Amendment to the Constitution that will be passed in December of 1865. And remember, Abraham Lincoln will be dead. When we talk about the Civil War, remember there have been many compromises, or there have been some compromises. Compromise of 1820, Kansas and Nebraska Act of 1854, the Compromise of 1850. Have been many attempts by the northern states and the southern states, I guess you could say, to postpone, to delay a civil war, because the nation was trying to exist as half slave and half free. And by 1860, the feeling was with the election of Lincoln on the viewpoint of the Southerners that if Lincoln was elected, that Lincoln was going to end slavery. Well, they did not listen to Lincoln because Lincoln said, and he wrote in a letter to Horace Greeley, who was a newspaper editor at that time, that if he could end slavery, and if he could end the Civil War by freeing the slaves, he would, and if he could end slavery by not freeing the slaves, he would. His focus was upon keeping the Union together. So there was definitely a misreading of from the viewpoint of the Southerners about Abraham Lincoln. And we also know from a piece of a speech he made in 1862 to Congress, the second annual address to Congress, that Lincoln will ask for money for colonization, that is to free the African Americans, to compensate the slave owners, and to colonize the Africans in Central America. Like Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln did not believe that free blacks and free whites could live together in the same nation. That's what I'm saying to you when the Civil War broke out. It was just like the Revolutionary War. And what I'm saying that with the Revolutionary War and with the Civil War is that the whites were going to try to fight the war and to exclude African Americans, be they slave or free. And remember, Dred Scott decision, 1857, the Supreme Court said that African Americans had no rights. It didn't make any difference if they were free or slave. It did not have any rights. It had to be respected by whites. So the point I'm making is that this was viewed as going to be a white man's war. And I would say to all of you, go back and read the literature of the time period. Go back and look at newspapers, and you will see that many of the newspapers in the North will talk about African American soldiers should not be fighting because they felt that they were not human. They felt that they were not men. I remember our class discussion about what it doesn't mean to be a man, and they did not. These white Northerners did not believe African Americans would fight or should fight. So initially, African Americans were kept out of what we would call the militias and the army. However, the U.S. Navy, on the other hand, will be more progressive, and there will be African Americans serving as shipboard firemen, stewards, coal heavers, and even boat pilots, starting in 1861. So we're in one hand, with the Navy, African Americans will be able to participate from day one in terms of the militias and the armies, what would be the troops. African Americans their participation was basically frowned upon and prohibited and not sought. Okay. After the Civil War broke out, there will be abolitionists, though, such as Frederick Douglass, who will argue that the enlistment of black soldiers would help the North win the war. And he especially made this argument to Abraham Lincoln, and he made it to Lincoln over and over again. Douglass did say, quote, "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters, U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button, and a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pockets. And there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship," unquote. So Douglass was trying to say to Abraham Lincoln and to others, let African Americans join the fight. Let African Americans be members of the Union Army, because it's almost like he was saying they have something to prove. That is, that they want to prove that they are citizens and that they have earned the right to be called citizens. However, this was what Lincoln was afraid of. He was afraid that arming African Americans, particularly former or escaped slaves, would push the law border states to secede. In other words, if he armed the former or escaped slaves, this would force states like Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland to secede from the Union. And this was especially true of Kentucky, that it was where Lincoln said this was a war to keep the Union together, then it would be seen as a war over the issue of slavery and whether slavery right or wrong. And he did not believe, and that would be Lincoln, he did not believe that the North could win the war. So I'm saying to you, initially in 1861, when this conflict started, African Americans were supposed to be sitting on the outside, looking in, and their participation was not wanted. But after 2 grueling years of war, Lincoln began to reconsider his position about the black soldier because initially, I think on both sides, North and the South, they saw they thought the war would be over very quickly. But by 1862, that was he saw, like others saw, that that was not true, uh, and that the war was nowhere close to ending, and the Union Army badly needed soldiers because the number of whites who were volunteering to join the conflict was dwindling. There was a draft, and the whites were, let's say, they were upset about the draft. I think especially in New York, and in New York, the whites will rebel against the draft. So, white volunteers were dwindling in numbers. Whites were rebelling against being drafted, and African Americans seemed to be more than eager to fight. So in 1862, July 17th of 1862, Congress will pass the Second Confiscation and Militia Act. And this was the first step towards the enlistment of African Americans in the Union Army. Now, it did not explicitly invite African Americans to join the fight, but it did authorize the president, quote, to employ as many persons of African descent as he may deem necessary and proper for the suppression of this rebellion, in such manner as he may judge best for the public welfare, unquote. So that means that Lincoln now had the freedom, and it's left up to him as president to allow African Americans to participate. And what African Americans began to do, they took this as their cue to form infantry regiments. For example, New Orleans, there will be 3 National Guard units that will be formed. The 1st, 2nd, and the 3rd Louisiana Native Guard. Then there will be the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry that will be formed in October of 1862. And then there will be the 1st South Carolina Infantry. So I'm saying these were unofficial regiments, but it will be where African Americans, ex-slaves, escaped slaves, will come together and unofficially begin to fight for the Union. And they will be officially ushered into service in January of 1863 after the Emancipation Proclamation was passed. Now, you may have heard of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. If you have seen the film Glory, featuring Denzel Washington, this deals with the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. And the governor of Massachusetts will put out a call in February of 1863 for black soldiers. This was going to be an all-black regiment. And more than 1,000 men will respond. Okay, this will be the first black regiment to be raised in the North. So, and most of the soldiers did not come from Massachusetts. A quarter of them came from slave states. Some of them came from Canada. Some of them came from the Caribbean. And the person who was chosen to lead this will be Robert Gould Shaw. And I want to stop there. Throughout up until Vietnam, African Americans will fight in segregated units. Notice what I said. This includes Revolutionary War of 1812, the Civil War, Spanish American War, World War I, World War II, Korea. And that is, there will be African Americans will be in separate units. And a lot of times, the whites who were over these units, who were the generals, who were the captains, who were the lieutenants, they will do it, but they did not believe in the African American soldier. And I've read some of Shaw's autobiography, and initially he did not believe in them, but he had seen it as a chance to be an officer, and so he accepted. And normally, the highest rank that an African American could get during the Civil War was the rank of sergeant. So we're not talking about captains or lieutenants or generals. The highest rank for an African American was a sergeant. Uh, July 18th, 1863, the 54th Massachusetts Regiment stormed a fort in South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, called Fort Wagner. And it will be the first time in the Civil War that black troops led an infantry attack. Unfortunately, 600 men of the 54th were outgunned and outnumbered, and it was 1,700 Confederate soldiers who waited inside the fort, ready for them. And almost half of the charging Union soldiers, including Colonel Shaw, were killed. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes more about African Americans and what they faced as soldiers. So first, Fort Pillow then will be the first one where first time that Civil War black troops led an infantry attack. And it was not successful because the Confederates were inside the fort, and the battle, the way they fought battles back then was just brutal. The African Americans would be coming across basically open area, and they were sitting ducks, to use an old cliche. In general, and let me say this before we move on to talking about what the African American soldier will face. At least 16 African Americans will receive the Congressional Medal of Honor for their bravery and their heroism in the Civil War. 16. In general, the Union Army was reluctant to use African American troops in combat. This was partly due to racism. There were many Union soldiers who believed that the black soldiers were not as skilled or as brave as white soldiers. And by this logic, they thought that the African Americans were better suited to be carpenters, cooks, guards, scouts, and teamsters, not to be in the front line and to be soldiers. Okay. Now, also remember, black soldiers and their officers were also placed in grave danger if they were ever captured in war. Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who was born in Kentucky, called the Emancipation Proclamation one of the measures in history, one of the worst measures in the history of guilty man, and promised that black prisoners of war would be enslaved or executed on the spot. Okay? And as for their white commanders, they would likewise be punished or even executed, because the white soldiers would be, officers would be inciting like a slave insurrection. So remember, a black soldier didn't have that threat, that they were not going to be seen as a fellow soldier. They were going to be seen as slaves. And the whites who were the officers, if they were captured, or if they were, there's a chance to, sometimes if they surrendered, they were going to be treated as whites who had led a slave rebellion. So there will be threats of Union reprisals against Confederate prisoners, which will force Southern officials to treat black soldiers who had been freed before the wars sometimes somewhat better than they treated black soldiers who had been formerly slaves. In other words, what I'm saying is that the Union is going to say to the Confederate, okay, we have Confederate prisoners, and how we treat our Confederate prisoners is going to be based upon how you treat black soldiers. And the black soldiers who had been free were seemingly treated better than those who had formerly been slaves. But in neither case was the treatment really good. Union officials tried to keep their troops out of harm's way as much as possible by keeping most of the black soldiers away from the front lines. Probably the worst incident will occur in Tennessee at a place called Fort Pillow. Fort Pillow, Pillow. And this is where the African American soldiers will surrender. Some will say they will surrender, and instead of treating them like prisoners of war or fellow combatants, there are rules to war. There are rules to war. I know that's a strange statement, but there are rules to war. And there's a certain way you're supposed to treat someone who surrenders. Instead of the Confederates treating the black soldiers as fellow combatants and following the rules of war, they slaughtered them at Fort Pillow because they treated them as escaped or runaway slaves. And Fort Pillow was under the direction of General Nathan Bedford Forrest. General Nathan Bedford Forrest. And you may wonder, well, why it's important to know him. Nathan Bedford Forrest will be considered the founder of the Ku Klux Klan that during Reconstruction will come into existence to destroy the progress that had been made by the governments established under Black Reconstruction that included African Americans. So Nathan Bedford Forrest will have his Confederate troops slaughter black troops at Fort Pillow in Tennessee. Okay? And he will be the founder of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, I was reading a few weeks ago, one of the things I didn't know, but I did find out, is that when Richmond, which will be the former capital of the Confederacy, when Richmond fell, the first Union troops that will go into Union, that will go into Richmond were black troops. And just imagine how they had to feel to walk into Richmond and to be the first troops to do that. Okay. While I'm thinking about it, before we talk about equal pay, if you ever have a chance and to go to Camp Nelson. Camp Nelson is in Jessamine County, Kentucky. It's about 30 to 45 minutes south of Lexington. And at Camp Nelson, there is a national cemetery there. But prior to, during the Civil War, Camp Nelson was the largest encampment for African Americans who had joined the Union Army. And they went to Camp Nelson to get training. The families that had escaped will go with them, and Camp Nelson will be crucial in keeping Kentucky in the war as part of the Union Army. And I always say this when we talk about Camp Nelson and do some research about it, because Camp Nelson is not a national park, but there's another designation that recently has been given to Camp Nelson. If you will go to the National Cemetery, there's an ask for the section of the cemetery that is called Cemetery Number 2. Cemetery Number 2. It has changed over the years, but originally, Cemetery Number 2 was like so much of what will occur in the South after the Civil War will be segregated. And that will be on the section where only black soldiers will be buried. And if you walk among the headstones, you will see headstones that will say USCT unknown. United States Colored Troops. Unknown means we don't know who it is. Unknown soldier. The name, I guess the body was so ravaged and destroyed at death that they were not able to identify that person. But it's always haunting when you walk out there, especially when it's quiet, which is, you talk about a national cemetery, mainly it is quiet because people are going to be, even the ones that are there who are alive are there out of respect. And you think about these men who died, and they had not, some of them had never, they had only been free because they had escaped and gone to Camp Nelson. But yet they were willing to die for something that they didn't have. But they were dying for something hopefully their children would have, their grandchildren would have. That would be freedom. And they are now laying there forever in a plot with a headstone that says USCT, United States Colored Troop Unknown. And if you also go to Camp Nelson, you also see something else. And you'd have to walk not too far, maybe a half mile. There is a big mass grave, a mass grave of African Americans who died during the winter of 1863, because the person who was over the fort at that time did not believe that their family should be there. Thus, the women and the children were kicked out, and this was one of the worst winters in the history of Jessamine County up to that point. They were kicked out, and they were supposed to walk from Camp Nelson to Lexington, and many of them would die. They would die, and because they will freeze to death, or they will starve to death, and they will be buried in this. All of them will be buried in this mass grave under this beautiful monument. So, if you ever get a chance and you're near Jessamine County, Kentucky, go visit Camp Nelson and to get the story about what it was really like to be an African American soldier in the Civil War. And even though, as they fought to end slavery in the Confederacy, African American soldiers were also fighting against injustice in the Union. Okay, the Union Army did pay black soldiers, but it paid them $10 a week. However, there was a clothing allowance, and the clothing allowance was $3, and you were paid $10, but $3 was taken out for clothing allowance, which means the black soldier only received $7 a week. The white soldier would receive $10 a week, but they also got $3 extra, okay, for clothing and some other essentials. Thus, the black soldier would really take home $7 a week, and the white soldier would take home $13. And it will not be until sometime into 1864 before Congress will pass a bill authorizing equal pay for black and white soldiers. By the time the war ended in 1865, about 180,000 black men had served as soldiers in the Union Army. 185. That will compose about 10% of the total Union fighting force. Most of the 180,000, that's about 90,000, about 50% then, were former enslaved people. In other words, 90,000 of them were individuals who had been enslaved, and they were from the Confederate States. The other 90,000 then had been free, and could have come from Canada, could have come from the North, and like I mentioned earlier, could have come from the Caribbean. Okay, they were also from the lower border states. So, what I'm saying is that of the 180,000, basically about a half of them came from the Confederate States. They were formerly people who had been enslaved. The other half came from the border states, and they may have also been free people of color from the North. About 40,000 black soldiers died in the war. 10,000 died in battle, but 30,000 died from illness or infection. And don't be shocked. That would even be true for white soldiers. When you're talking about if there was a limb that had been injured because of the person had been shot, quite frequently they give the person alcohol to drink, and then they would just cut it off. So that was very, very normal. More people got killed from infection than they did from battle. So what am I saying is that Frederick Douglass was right. It took a while before Abraham Lincoln realized it and accepted it. That African Americans wanted to fight in the Civil War to prove that they were citizens. And I guess you could also say to earn their freedom. They did this even though many of the whites that they will fight beside and supposedly fighting for the same cause, did not want them in the conflict. So by 1865, the war is over. Lincoln, as we know, will be assassinated. And that will set the stage for the next historical era that we call Reconstruction. And Reconstruction will be a time period that will start with a great lot of promise, and it will end in misery for African Americans. Now, it's like so many other things when we talk about change, when we get to there will be progress, there will be misery, but then there's still going to be progress. I know that doesn't make any sense, but hopefully you'll see that when we start to talking about education. Okay? We may lose politically, we may lose economically, but Reconstruction is also when we get the beginnings of what we would now call the HBCUs. So sometimes in life, with every step forward, 2 steps forward, you take 1 back, and then you take 2 steps forward again and 1 step back, but you're still making progress. All right. So when we talk about the Civil War, remember, Southerners realized that it was over the issue of slavery before Northerners were really willing to accept that was over the issue of slavery. And African Americans realized that if the North won, then there was a great chance that slavery was ending. Oh, and one final point that some people have asked, were African Americans in the Confederate Army? Yes, they were. But by the end of the war, there was a shortage of soldiers for the Confederacy. They did try to recruit slaves to join the Confederate Army with the promise that they would gain their freedom. It will upset a lot of whites, because how are you going to fight for slavery and then you grant freedom to the same people that you want to enslave? So by 1865, the handwriting was on the wall for the South when it really made that appeal. But there is no doubt the Civil War could not have been won without the black soldier. And the black soldier, even though he was treated differently, even though he faced racism, even though he received unequal pay, he will make a difference because he was fighting for something important. And what he was fighting for was freedom. Take care.